16. Casey Wise. On a hot June afternoon in 2021, police in Parma, Ohio responded to the residence of 31-year-old Casey Wise, who'd called 911 to report that she was locked out of her car with her dead husky inside. She told responding officers, who arrived at the house at around 3:00 p.m., that the dog had been in the vehicle since 4:00 a.m. After confirming that the dog was dead, Parma Animal Control Officer Julie Kosick could be heard on body cam footage saying she wanted Wise arrested. And as Wise was being escorted to a police car, Kosick allegedly said, "Get out of here before I effing kill you." Later on in the video, Wise said that she put the dog in the vehicle at around noon that day with the air conditioning on so she could cool off. She claimed that the car died without her realizing it, leading to the dog's death. According to an incident report, Wise had put the dog in the vehicle for extended periods of time on numerous previous occasions. And as a result, she was booked on one count of cruelty toward a companion animal. In the meantime, Kosick apologized for her behavior through the Parma Police Department, which noted in a Facebook post that Wise had been cited for animal-related violations 20 times over a 9-month period. The post further claimed that under Ohio law, the police didn't have the authority to remove the dog from Wise's care, despite the repeated complaints. In early 2022, Wise pleaded guilty to the cruelty charge as part of a plea deal and managed to avoid prison time. She was sentenced to an intervention plan, which is similar to probation and enables a criminal defendant to avoid a conviction by agreeing to receive treatment and follow certain rules. And one can only hope that she's no longer allowed to own any pets. 15. Zachariah Peterson. Around 2,200 employees at an automotive assembly plant in Clay Como, Michigan, were faced with a terrifying situation in July of 2023 when they were forced to evacuate their workplace on a moment's notice due to a bomb threat. According to Clay County investigators, 19-year-old Zachariah Peterson made the call, claiming that he was armed with an AK-47, a handgun, and a pound of C4 explosives strapped to his chest. Numerous law enforcement agencies responded to a call at the 6 million square foot, or 557,000 square meter plant. They spent the next 6 hours thoroughly searching the facility before determining that the threat was a hoax. Clay County Sheriff Will Aiken later told news reporters that the agency had reason to believe that the threat wasn't real, but that they had to treat it like it was, just in case. After all, it's better to be safe than sorry. Thankfully, though, nobody was injured. Prosecutors claim that Peterson called in the threat during the early evening for the specific purpose of promoting an evacuation so that an acquaintance of his wouldn't have to go to work that day. And for all intents and purposes, it worked. After being evacuated, the employees were sent home and the night shift was canceled. But the favor for a friend is coming at a high price for Peterson, who was charged with one felony count of making a terrorist threat. If convicted, he could face up to 7 years in prison and a fine of up to $10,000. 14. Johnny Yates. Polk County Sheriff Grady Judd is internet famous for telling it like it is. In his social media posts about his agency's run-ins with some of Central Florida's most peculiar crime suspects, a 41-year-old wanted fugitive named Johnny Yates earned his place in the spotlight in October 2023 when he allegedly posted a sign outside his Lakeland home stating, "Johnny Yates does not live here." Deputies visited the residence after receiving a tip that Yates was hiding inside, and upon arriving, they found the neatly written message on a dry erase board that was leaning against a window. In a Facebook post, the sheriff's office described how the deputies dispensed surrender smoke into the home in an attempt to force Yates outside. 4 other individuals soon emerged, but Yates was nowhere to be seen. After a second dose of surrender smoke was released inside with no luck, deputies entered the house and found Yates hiding inside a hollowed-out piece of furniture. As a result, Yates was booked into the Polk County Jail on outstanding charges of aggravated battery, false imprisonment, and tampering with evidence. Records show that he's no stranger to the facility, with multiple previous visits dating at least as far back as 2002. In addition to the case he was most recently picked up on, he's facing charges of methamphetamine trafficking, possession of drug paraphernalia, and resisting an officer without violence. According to the Facebook post announcing the arrest, the 4 other people at the property were uncooperative. They each received a parting gift of a charge of resisting and an all-expense-paid trip to Grady Judd's bed and breakfast. 13. Paul Turovsky. After his bride fell asleep during their honeymoon in August 2022, Florida real estate agent Paul Turovsky allegedly slipped out of the couple's hotel room in Tampa and attempted to purchase the services of a prostitute. According to the Hillsborough County Sheriff's Office, HCSO, the 34-year-old newlywed connected with a woman online and went to meet her at a nearby hotel with the expectation that he would pay for her intimacy. But instead of getting the fun time he came for, he walked right into an undercover sting that was being carried out by the HCSO's Human Trafficking Squad. Turovsky was charged with soliciting prostitution. And during a press conference announcing the arrest, Hillsborough County Sheriff Chad Chronister wondered out loud if wedding guests would be able to get a refund on their gifts, since it would only be natural to assume that Turovsky's marriage was short-lived. The case came as part of a larger operation that was being conducted in an effort to crack down on human trafficking in the area. According to Chronister, 176 suspects had been arrested in the previous 3 months alone, and 360 arrests had been made since the operation began about a year earlier. In addition to catching husbands in compromising situations, and often naming suspects in the media, the sting led to the rescue of several trafficking victims. Unfortunately, though, the outcome of Turovsky's case and the current state of his marriage are unclear. 12. Imon Thompson. In November 2023, a woman loaded $800 worth of Barbie toys into a shopping cart at a Walmart in Lockport, New York, and then proceeded to wheel the merchandise out of the store without paying. Later identified by authorities as 26-year-old Imon Thompson, she loaded the goods into an SUV and drove off while employees called the police. New York State troopers spotted the vehicle a short while later and attempted to pull Thompson over, but the accused thief allegedly ignored the flashing lights and put the pedal to the metal, reaching speeds of over 100 miles per hour, or 161 kilometers per hour, as she eluded law enforcement. The troopers then called off the pursuit due to safety concerns and decided to take a different approach. They showed up at the woman's Buffalo residence the next day and arrested her on suspicion of petty larceny, fleeing an officer, and multiple traffic violations. Thompson was released on her own recognizance with instructions to return to court at a later date. 11. Robert Riverner. 58-year-old Trump superfan Robert Riverner Jr. was granted compassionate release from federal prison in May of 2020 after serving the majority of a 12-year sentence for scamming unsuspecting investors and lenders out of $25 million. He was ordered to pay $22 million restitution to his victims in monthly installments of $400. In Florida, most felons are eligible to restore their voting rights after satisfying all the terms of their sentence, including probation and fines. Riverner is due to be released from probation in 2025, but considering the amount of restitution he owes, he'll likely never be able to vote again. This hasn't stopped him from trying, though, according to authorities, who are now accusing him of voter fraud. Several months after his release from prison, Riverner allegedly forged an absentee ballot in his deceased father's name. According to authorities, Robert Riverner Sr. passed away 4 days before the ballot was placed in the mail. A poll worker noticed the discrepancy, and the vote wasn't counted, but it would be another 3 years before Riverner was arrested on suspicion of forgery and voting fraud in October 2023. While announcing the charges, Chief Assistant State Attorney Walter Forgy said that a handwriting expert had determined that the ballot in Riverner Sr.'s name had been forged. Riverner Jr. denied the allegations during questioning, claiming that he didn't know whether his father had voted in the 2020 election. Shortly after his arrest, he told the Orlando Sentinel that the charges were politically motivated, stating, "People who don't like my effectiveness in helping President Trump want to take me out." Riverner also fell under suspicion of voting-related crimes in 2022 after authorities discovered that he'd voted despite being a felon with unpaid restitution. Prosecutors decided not to pursue charges after concluding that they couldn't prove that he meant to vote illegally. For now, he remains free on $10,000 bail pending the outcome of his case. 10. Dominic Calderon. While riding his bicycle in Albuquerque in early 2020, a man later identified as 36-year-old Dominic Calderon approached a woman he believed was a prostitute and asked her about rates. They settled on a price, but Calderon allegedly told the woman that he wouldn't have the money until later that week and asked for her phone number so he could set up an appointment after he got paid. Noticing that the suspect was carrying takeout from Chili's, the undercover agent asked Calderon what was in the bag. He said it was a burger, and the agent offered to exchange her services for the food. According to police, Calderon agreed to the arrangement, only to realize moments later that he was being busted in a sting. He was arrested on suspicion of patronizing prostitutes, and the burger was taken as evidence. At the time, Calderon was on supervised release for previous convictions, but after learning about the arrest, authorities revoked his probation and upgraded the case to a felony. 9. Lily Rinker. During the pre-dawn hours one morning in November 2023, police were dispatched to a Best Western hotel room in Stuart, Florida, where they were met by 23-year-old college golfer Lily Rinker. According to a probable cause affidavit, the distraught young woman explained that part of her weed stash disappeared after she hung out in the room with her friend Carlos, whom she'd met a week earlier. It wasn't until after Carlos left the hotel that Rinker opened her blue grinder and noticed about a half gram of marijuana missing from her $30 stash. Not knowing what else to do about the stolen $5 worth of pot, she dialed 911. After requesting Rinker's ID, the responding officer discovered that she had 2 open arrest warrants in Palm Beach County. One warrant was for failing to appear in court for an outstanding criminal mischief case, while the other was for failing to appear for a probation violation hearing in connection with a DUI case. Rinker had also been arrested in 2022 for allegedly hitting her dad in the face. She reportedly told law enforcement that she was upset at her father for posting a photo of her holding a vape on social media, which she feared would jeopardize her ability to participate in college athletics. In the end, though, prosecutors declined to pursue charges in the case. This wasn't the first time a Florida resident had called the police to report stolen drugs. In fact, it seems to happen surprisingly often. In 2017, a 32-year-old self-described drug dealer named David Blackman called 911 to report that someone had stolen cash and cocaine out of his car in Fort Walton Beach. Blackman allegedly told a responding deputy that the thief took $50 and a quarter ounce of the drug from the center console. While looking inside the car, the deputy spotted the supposedly missing bag of cocaine and a crack rock in the center console, along with a crack pipe on the floor. The cash wasn't found, and Blackman was arrested on suspicion of cocaine possession, resisting arrest without violence, and possession of paraphernalia. More recently, in September 2023, a 33-year-old Largo man named Eric Thomas allegedly called 911 to report that someone had stolen $10 from him during a weed sale. According to a police report, responding officers arrived to find him clutching 11 bags of weed, amounting to 40 grams total, and they found 2 packets of cocaine in his wallet. As a result, he was charged with possession and remains in custody on $7,000 bail. 8. Caleb Phillips. An unresolved DUI case caught up with 46-year-old Caleb Phillips in November 2023, when a deputy picked him up on a warrant in Indian River County, Florida, for failing to appear in court more than a year earlier. After an initial search at the local jail, the deputy asked Phillips if he had any additional items in or on his body that hadn't been detected during the pat-down. He said no, even after being warned that if he lied, he would face an additional criminal charge. As Phillips changed from his civilian clothing into a jail uniform, an observant corrections officer noticed a plastic cylinder containing a package of Advil lodged beneath his privates inside his underwear. According to an arrest report, the package of Advil contained a plastic bag filled with multiple clear crystal-like rocks, which were thought to be methamphetamine, and a small metal tool. After being read his Miranda rights, Phillips chose to speak voluntarily with law enforcement. He allegedly denied placing the suspected drugs in his underwear and claimed that he didn't know how the contraband got there, speculating that perhaps someone had planted it. Phillips also reportedly told deputies that he thought the package contained Advil, but it's safe to assume that he didn't have a good explanation for why someone would want to plant legal or illegal drugs in his underpants. In addition to the outstanding DUI charge, he now stands accused of drug possession and smuggling contraband or a controlled substance into a detention facility. And as of December 2023, he remains held without bond at the Indian River County Jail. 7. Brian Edward Johnson. A lot of weird things happen at courthouses, but even longtime employees were likely shocked when a man entered the Tulsa County Courthouse in Oklahoma naked from the waist down in early 2019. According to law enforcement, 55-year-old Brian Edward Johnson parked his Porsche 911 outside the courthouse at around 10 a.m. He then proceeded to enter the building wearing only a blue t-shirt, a leather harness, sunglasses, and shoes. Surveillance footage showed Johnson glancing over his shoulder a few times as he approached the entrance on foot. A deputy promptly handcuffed him at the security screening, and he was charged with felony indecent exposure. During his initial court appearance, Johnson told the judge that he entered the courthouse naked on a dare. He admitted to disrobing from the waist down inside his car before entering the building. After being arrested on a $2,000 bond, he told local news station Fox 23 that he only expected to get charged with a misdemeanor and that he regretted his decision now that he was facing a felony. 6. Clifton Williams. 64-year-old Clifton Williams was all smiles after being arrested in May of 2023 for allegedly shooting his roommate for eating the last Hot Pocket at their shared Louisville home. According to an arrest report, the victim told responding officers that Williams got mad and began throwing tiles at him after discovering that the last remaining frozen snack was gone. The roommate said that he fought back, but ultimately decided to leave the property. By then, the fight had spilled outside. The victim later told police that when he said he was leaving, Williams went back inside and retrieved a gun. When he saw the firearm, he said, "Don't shoot." But just moments later, he took a bullet to the buttocks. After running for several blocks with his injury, the roommate managed to find help. He was soon transported to the hospital and survived the bullet wound. Police arrested Williams several hours later on suspicion of felony assault. He pleaded not guilty and was then held on $7,500 bail while awaiting his next court date. But unfortunately, the outcome of the case is unclear. 5. Rashad MC Griff. A 42-year-old Florida woman was relaxing in her bed at her Vero Beach home in the middle of the night in August 2023, when the father of her 3 children allegedly barged in uninvited and brutally assaulted her. According to a police report, the woman had taunted 30-year-old Rashad MC Griff just minutes earlier with text messages insulting the size of his manhood after discovering that he was sleeping with prostitutes. She'd even sent him a photo of someone else's nether region for comparison purposes. Enraged by the mockery, McGriff allegedly entered the woman's bedroom and began striking her in the face repeatedly with a closed fist. He was also accused of choking his ex and briefly rendering her unable to breathe before taking her cell phone away and refusing to give it back for at least 10 minutes. By the time law enforcement arrived, McGriff had tossed the phone onto the woman's sofa and fled the scene. A responding officer noted in a report that the victim was bleeding from the bridge of her nose. Records show that she'd previously sued McGriff 3 times for failing to pay child support. She had most recently filed a case 2 months prior to his arrest, but the case appears to be ongoing. McGriff was eventually apprehended on charges of battery and burglary, and he also stands accused of violating his parole for a previous case. He's currently free on a $16,000 bond while awaiting his next court date. 4. Max Alexander Kant. On a Saturday afternoon in December 2023, a man entered the Ink Gods tattoo shop in St. Petersburg, Florida, and asked how much it would cost to get the Waffle House logo inked onto his calf. Later identified by police as 33-year-old Max Alexander Kant, he opted for a black and white version of the tattoo because it was $100 cheaper than having the artwork done in color. But when it came time to pay, the suspect allegedly failed to hand over a single dollar toward the $250 bill. According to a police report, Kant said that he didn't have his debit card and was unable to prove that he had enough money in his bank account to cover the cost of the tattoo. He reportedly failed to satisfy the debt despite being given multiple options by the shop's owner, Neil Marcus, and was accused by law enforcement of being intoxicated at the scene. Police found just $6 in Kant's possession, along with his driver's license. He was subsequently booked into custody on a misdemeanor theft count, and while he failed to pay for his new ink, he conveniently managed to come up with $150 for bail. 3. Stephanie Boyd. What began as a verbal argument between a Missouri couple inside their Veneta Park home quickly escalated into physical violence in October 2023. According to police, 38-year-old Stephanie Boyd exited the house and got into her car to leave. Her 31-year-old husband climbed onto the hood of the vehicle to stop her, but she drove off anyway. Boyd allegedly drove for nearly 5 miles, or 8 kilometers, along an interstate and passed through a construction zone, traveling at various speeds as her husband clung to the hood of the car. A police officer saw what was happening and chased the vehicle for roughly a half mile, 0.8 kilometers, before Boyd pulled over. In an arrest report, the officer noted observing fingernail scratches in the husband's beard and redness on his head. The cop further stated that he believed Boyd was a danger and that she'd return to her shared home with the victim if she were released following her arrest. Boyd was booked into custody on suspicion of first-degree domestic assault and resisting arrest by fleeing. If convicted as charged, she could face up to 15 years in prison and $10,000 in fines. For now, the judge set her bail at $100,000 and ordered her to stay away from her husband. 2. Robert Clark and Sarah Fazakis. After being flooded with 911 calls one night in November 2023, police discovered a couple having intercourse along a busy roadside in the Gulf Coast city of Dunedin, Florida. According to an arrest report, officers arrived to find 60-year-old Robert Clark lying on his back fully naked. 55-year-old Sarah Fazakis was equally nude, and the two suspects were going at it shamelessly, with no apparent concern for who might be watching. Clark allegedly expressed no remorse for his actions, while Fazakis told arresting deputies that it had always been a dream of hers to do the dirty along the Dunedin Causeway. Her decision to check off the bucket list item landed her and Clark in custody on suspicion of exposing themselves, and Fazakis was hit with an additional felony narcotics charge after police found an Altoids container filled with Klonopin inside her purse. She bonded out for $2,150, while Clark, who was on a lifetime probation for a previous case, posted $50,000 bail. he faces an additional felony charge of lewd and lascivious exhibition. We have another great video lined up right after number 1. If you need more of a daily world list dosage, then be sure to stay tuned if you haven't seen that one yet. 1. Travis Carlson. Early one morning in May of 2023, a Minnesota resident peered out of the window of their Duluth home and noticed their neighbor, 37-year-old Travis Carlson, wearing a helmet and smashing his own windows. The concerned civilian would later tell police that they observed Carlson under his truck with gas cans and going in and out of the house, shortly before seeing his upstairs apartment erupt into a fireball. Around the same time, Carlson's downstairs tenant awoke to the sound of him smashing and breaking things. Roughly 20 minutes later, Carlson allegedly knocked on the person's door and warned him that the house was on fire. Then he fled the scene. Officers arrived to find the house engulfed in flames, with the Billy Joel song "We Didn't Start the Fire" blaring from inside. But they quickly concluded that Carlson did in fact start the fire. According to a police report, there were holes drilled into the gas tank of Carlson's truck, with gas can lids and a drill lying on the ground nearby. After extinguishing the blaze, investigators found evidence of an accelerant having been doused on the furniture, floor, and walls of Carlson's apartment. The good news was that Carlson's tenants weren't injured in the fire. The bad news was that they lost everything they owned. Police located Carlson the next day and noticed fresh burn injuries to his legs and arms, while taking him into custody on a first-degree arson charge. If convicted as charged, he could face up to 20 years in prison and a fine of up to $20,000. His bail was set at $75,000, and records show that he's not currently in custody, although his case appears to be ongoing. It's unclear what Carlson was thinking when he allegedly set fire to his own home, or if he was thinking at all. During his initial court hearing, St. Louis County Prosecutor Vicky Wanta told the judge that there were possible drug-related and/or mental health concerns surrounding the defendant's behavior.
9. William Atkinson. In 2021, 34-year-old William Atkinson received a series of video calls from his wife of 3 years while she was hooking up with another man in a car outside a Pennsylvania hotel. Enraged by what he saw, Atkinson got a friend to drive him from Maryland to the Best Western in Somerset, where he allegedly attacked his wife and her lover. He then fled the scene, and police were called to the property. Responding officers arrived to find Atkinson's wife struggling to breathe and crying for help. She was suffering from multiple injuries and was bleeding profusely from her face, nose, and mouth. And according to a felony complaint, the woman was extremely intoxicated and uncooperative. After being taken into custody, Atkinson told investigators that his wife was egging him on with her X-rated video calls. He claimed that he only hit the victim with an open hand, but her injuries suggested that the attack might have been a little more brutal than the suspect was willing to admit to. Atkinson was charged with aggravated assault and reckless endangerment. He was then held on $30,000 bail, but he no longer appears to be in custody, and, unfortunately, the current status of the case is unclear. 8. Joe Schilling. It's unclear whether 31-year-old Justin Balboa knew that he was blocking a walkway during a night out drinking with friends at a bar in Fort Lauderdale, Florida in 2021. He was talking with his group when MMA fighter Joe Schilling tried to get past him. In a video of the encounter, Balboa appeared to take a step toward the professional kickboxer. Then, reacting with lightning speed, Schilling immediately began to throw punches, knocking Balboa unconscious. And as a result, the injured bargoer was hospitalized with a head injury. It's clear, based on the footage of the incident, that Schilling is a much larger man than Balboa. Despite his advantageous size, he claimed that he acted in self-defense and that he feared for his life when he knocked Balboa out. Schilling also accused Balboa of hurling a racial slur at him before things got physical and said that he'd taken action against the evil in this world. Balboa filed a $30,000 lawsuit against Schilling for battery and against the bar for negligence. And in 2023, a Broward County judge ruled in favor of Schilling under Florida's Stand Your Ground law, which allows a person who feels like their life is in danger to take whatever action is necessary to neutralize the threat. The court also granted Schilling immunity from allegations of negligence and battery in connection with the case. But this wasn't the first time that Schilling made headlines for hitting someone in public. 3 years earlier, in 2018, he beat up a homeless man after catching the vagrant doing something inappropriate in the bathroom of his gym. Footage posted to the fighter's Instagram account showed Schilling throwing the man onto a sidewalk, battering him with a backpack and kicking him. The much smaller and clearly terrified man could then be seen trying to run away as Schilling tossed him around like a ragdoll and cornered him. In a follow-up video, Schilling explained that he was infuriated because his gym is family-friendly and it was no place for what he walked in on when he entered the bathroom. He said that the homeless man had snuck into the gym to use the shower, which didn't really bother him, even though the man was trespassing. When the visitor turned off the shower though, Schilling began banging on the door in an attempt to get him to leave. But the man refused to exit the stall and screamed at Schilling, who continued knocking on the door. And when the man finally opened the door, Schilling realized what had been taking him so long. It's unclear whether the police were called, but it appears as though no charges were ever pressed in regards to the case. 7. Michael Barisone. Former Olympian Michael Barisone was known internationally for being one of the world's best dressage riders. If you've never heard of it, dressing is an equestrian sport involving a series of fancy steps and moves. It's almost like a dance and is considered by some to be an art form. Dressage is extremely difficult to master and requires both a good relationship between horse and rider and complete control of the horse's movements at all times. In 2018, an aspiring dressage rider named Lauren Kanarek, her 2 horses and her fiancé Robert Goodwin moved on to Barisone's farm in Morris County, New Jersey. Kanarek wanted to learn from the best, and her wealthy family was willing to pay top dollar so she could dedicate herself full-time to the sport. But the young woman was dissatisfied with the amount of time Barisone devoted to coaching her. He had other students and Kanarek had expected more one-on-one sessions. She was also upset with the fact that the training sometimes involved working with other coaches, even though they were highly skilled and perfectly qualified to teach. Kanarek began expressing her frustrations on social media, and during the summer of 2019 the tone of her complaints escalated. The disgruntled student accused Barisone of being racist, homophobic, and anti-Semitic, and while Barisone's many friends and supporters knew that this wasn't true, the allegations still put his reputation in jeopardy. He began to fear that the slanderous rants would ruin his business, which had worked incredibly hard to build, and he slowly began to unravel mentally. In another post, Kanarek wrote, "It's about time to possibly go to war. Anyone who repeatedly kicks a resting beast will eventually wake her up." Barisone would later tell 48 Hours that he asked Kanarek and Goodwin to leave his property, but that they refused. At least 4 911 calls were made during that summer as the feud intensified, with Barisone telling law enforcement that he feared for his life. But the police classified the dispute as a landlord-tenant issue to be resolved in civil court, and the warring parties were left butting heads on a sprawling farm that had become too small for them both. The hostilities reached their breaking point on August 7th of 2019, when Barisone shot Kanarek twice in the chest outside his farmhouse where she was living. Goodwin tackled Barisone to the ground, while Kanarek mustered up the strength to call 911. Police arrived at the residence to find Goodwin on top of Barisone, while Kanarek bled profusely from life-threatening injuries nearby. Kanarek was rushed to the hospital in critical condition. She was put into a medically induced coma and managed to pull through after fighting for her life, but she faced a long road to recovery. And in the meantime, authorities charged Barisone with 2 counts of attempted murder. Barisone's attorneys accused Kanarek of wearing down the trainer's mental health until he lost touch with reality. He claimed that he didn't remember committing the shooting, and his lawyers urged the jury to find him not guilty by reason of insanity. For all intents and purposes, Kanarek was a victim, even if her behavior was maddening. But Barisone received a lot of support from family, friends, fellow athletes, and equestrian colleagues, who all said that the shooting was extremely out of character. They believed that there might have been extenuating circumstances for Barisone to have taken such drastic measures, and the jury ultimately agreed. Insanity rulings are extremely rare, especially since they spare defendants from prison time and typically don't come with fixed sentences. But the jurors concluded that Barisone was temporarily insane and therefore not guilty for shooting Kanarek. He was ordered to undergo inpatient care at a psychiatric facility until doctors conclude that he's no longer a danger to himself or others. But as of 2023, he remains in treatment. And a court hearing is scheduled toward the end of the year to check on his progress. 6. Deadly garden hose dispute. In 2020, a man in his early 70s named Rodney John Lee began complaining about his neighbors at a public housing complex in Melbourne, Australia. And it started with his frustrations over loud music and alcohol consumption in communal areas that were shared by residents. Lee's grievances became even more frequent the following year, when he began accusing a new neighbor of cooking and selling drugs. His inability to get along with community members reached a boiling point in early 2022, when Lee became angry with neighbors for turning off the tap to a garden hose that he was using to water plants outside. He'd left the hose running while he stepped into his apartment, and when someone saw that the water was turned on for seemingly no reason, they turned it off. Lacking the patience for a civilized discussion about the issue, Lee screamed at his neighbors, who were in the middle of a social gathering, and threatened to kill them if they turned the hose off again. And during that same altercation, he also hit one of his neighbors with the hose. But it really bothered 62-year-old Salmoto Gazio to see water being wasted, and he felt strongly enough about the issue to turn the hose off again when he found it running and not being used for a second time. So, when Lee erupted into his second rampage of the day, Gazio simply explained that he didn't believe in wasting water. Lee called Gazio a worthless human being, prompting Gazio to ask Lee to leave the gathering. The irate senior citizen then stepped back into his apartment, retrieved a gun, and charged back outside. And with the weapon now in his hands, he shot Gazio in the arm and chest. As Lee reloaded the gun, Gazio and another neighbor, 57-year-old Tibor Laszlo, fled into a nearby apartment. But they were unable to escape the barrage of gunfire, and Lee shot both men. Laszlo was fatally struck in the chest while tending to Gazio's injuries. Lee surrendered himself to authorities shortly after the double homicide, and he owned up to his actions in court by pleading guilty to both murders. Lee was sentenced to 30 years in prison, with a minimum of 24 years. But at 74 years old and in poor health, he'll likely die behind bars before he ever sees freedom again. During Lee's sentencing, the judge acknowledged that the defendant had taken responsibility for his crimes, but he criticized Lee for failing to express remorse and for claiming to be a victim who was provoked into taking deadly action. 5. Contentious co-parenting clash. After calling it quits on their relationship, Edmundas Daugsa and Ingrida Makiokite remained committed to giving their daughter a stable upbringing. The little girl lived with her father full-time in the Irish city of Dundalk, but she still saw her mother on occasion. And the arrangement seemed to be working out well until September 2018, when Ingrida petitioned the court for primary custody and won. The hearing lasted just 4 minutes. It certainly wasn't enough time for both parties to argue their cases, and Edmundas was devastated by the decision. So, in the days following the ruling, he took pills and drank alcohol to cope with the emotional pain of his daughter's absence. And when Ingrida refused to drop the child off for a planned visit with Edmundas just a few days later, he reached his breaking point. Armed with a knife, he went to Ingrida's apartment complex to discuss the issue. At some point during the argument, Edmundas pulled out the knife and stabbed Ingrida 19 times in the courtyard of her building. She died from her injuries, which included at least 1 stab wound to the heart and 3 or 4 to the lungs, and as a result, Edmundas was charged with murder. During his trial, he admitted to the fatal stabbing, but the defense argued that the circumstances surrounding the case should be considered as mitigating factors in determining the defendant's conviction and punishment. Edmundas' lawyer described his client as distraught and destroyed as a human being after losing access to his daughter. And the defense further argued that Edmundas felt railroaded by the family court system with good reason, and urged the court to consider the possibility that he'd been provoked by Ingrida's refusal to let him see their daughter. But these pleas for sympathy failed to sway the jury into a position of leniency, and Edmundas was convicted of murder. During his sentencing hearing, the judge pointed out how his decision to grab a knife and take it with him to the crime scene didn't show the kind of loss of control that's typically required under the legal definition of provocation. So, Edmundas was sentenced to life in prison, and his daughter lost both parents as the result of his decision to resort to violence. 4. Police-involved shooting sparks Parisian protests. 2023 has been a rough year for France when it comes to civil unrest. From January to March, a waste workers' strike caused weeks' worth of garbage to pile up on the streets. And 4 months after the strike ended, the death of a young civilian at the hands of a police officer triggered violent protests throughout the country. The upheaval began after a delivery driver named Nahel Merzouk was shot dead by law enforcement in the Parisian suburb of Nanterre. Police initially claimed that Merzouk, who was of Moroccan and Algerian descent, was driving at them when they decided to use deadly force. But the incident was captured on camera, and the footage appeared to show that Merzouk had been shot at point-blank range while attempting to drive away from officers during a traffic stop. At the very least, the video told a much different story than the narrative that was offered by police. After the clip surfaced, French President Emmanuel Macron condemned the shooting as inexcusable. Merzouk's death sparked some of the country's worst protests in nearly 2 decades in terms of their geographic period. Over a 5-night period, demonstrators burned at least 2,000 cars and trashed hundreds of public buildings. And as a result, authorities arrested more than 3,000 people in connection with the widespread disorder. The last time France saw rioting on this scale was in 2005, after 2 teenagers were fatally electrocuted while hiding from the police. Much like the protests that occurred after Merzouk's death in 2023, the earlier demonstrations erupted in the suburbs outside France and other major cities. Known as banlieues, these often poverty-stricken communities are home to many citizens of African descent. Evidence suggests that young, non-white people in banlieues are up to 20 times more likely to be stopped by the police than white civilians in more well-to-do neighborhoods. It's a problem that people have long been aware of, but because France adheres to a so-called colorblind attitude toward race and ethnicity, no official data has been collected or analyzed. Without accurate information, there's no way to gauge the true extent of the disadvantage that minorities experience. And without knowing how severe the inequality is, it's impossible to plan an effective response to it. After 5 nights of civil unrest, the protests following Merzouk's death finally calmed down. But as the bigger issues surrounding the riots continue to go unaddressed, the likelihood of future protests remains ever present. 3. Competition between co-workers. On what began as a normal morning in April 2022, police responded to an emergency call at a farm equipment yard outside Bakersfield, California. Officers arrived to find an employee, 56-year-old Hector Javier Castaneda Vasquez, lying on his back with massive injuries to his head and face. And unfortunately, he was declared dead at the scene. Vasquez had been bludgeoned to death with a metal pipe by his co-worker, Jose Luis Gutierrez Rosales, who fled the scene before law enforcement arrived. But 10 days later, he was apprehended in connection to the crime. The victim and the defendant had worked together for 3 years leading up to the murder. Shortly after his arrest, Gutierrez Rosales told investigators that his co-workers had made fun of him because of rumors that Vasquez was sleeping with his ex-girlfriend. The taunting was later described as persistent ridicule and bullying. Unable to cope with the humiliation in a rational way, Gutierrez Rosales snapped and brutally beat Vasquez to death. He also admitted to telling the victim, "This is for getting involved with my family," when he made the fateful split-second decision to resort to violence. Detectives interviewed the ex-girlfriend, who said that she and Gutierrez Rosales had dated for about 3 months before going their separate ways a few weeks before the attack. The woman told the police that her ex had anger issues, although by that point this was fairly evident. A jury then convicted Gutierrez Rosales of second-degree murder, and he was sentenced to 16 years to life in prison. 2. Convicted creep versus irate inmate. After serving as the team doctor of the United States women's national gymnastics team for 18 years, Larry Nassar was criminally charged with assaulting hundreds of clients. The true extent of his crimes and the exact number of his victims may never be known, but it went on for years. In 2017, Nassar was convicted in both federal courts and Michigan State Court on numerous counts. He received a 60-year federal prison sentence along with 2 state sentences, one for 40 to 125 years and another for 40 to 175 years. His state sentences will run consecutively to his federal prison sentence, ensuring the disgraced former physician never sees a single day of freedom again. In 2023, Nassar was stabbed 10 times by a fellow inmate at the Coleman Federal Prison in Wildwood, Florida. A source told ESPN that Nassar suffered at least 2 stab wounds to the neck, while the rest of the injuries were to his back and chest. The 59-year-old was rushed to a nearby hospital where he received treatment for his wounds. Another source identified the attacker as 49-year-old Shane McMillan, who had previous convictions for assaulting a corrections officer and the attempted murder of a fellow inmate at the notorious Supermax prison complex in Florence, Colorado. The insider told the Associated Press that McMillan was angered by a lewd comment Nassar made while they were watching women play tennis on TV. And the attack happened later on inside Nassar's cell. The outcome of the assault may have been much different if 4 inmates hadn't rushed into the cell and pulled McMillan off of Nassar. Corrections officers also responded to the chaos and performed life-saving efforts on Nassar while waiting for the ambulance to arrive. But this wasn't even the first time Nassar was attacked while in custody. At the beginning of his sentence 5 years earlier, in 2018, he was assaulted within hours of being released into the general population at a penitentiary in Arizona. It's likely safe to assume that the nature of Nassar's crimes made him a target for other inmates. An investigation later concluded that Nassar couldn't be housed safely at the prison, so he was shuffled around for the next few months before landing at the facility in Florida. Then, shortly after the 2023 attack, authorities announced that Nassar would be relocated once again. We have another great video lined up right after number 1. If you need more of a daily wordless dosage, then be sure to stay tuned if you haven't seen that one yet. 1. Henry Morales. High school sweethearts Henry and Melina Morales married shortly after graduating in 1997. They moved from Toronto to Ecuador for a brief period before returning to Ontario and settling down in the city of Brampton. Then, in 2005, Melina traveled to Ecuador for a family event. But when she returned to Canada, she confessed to Henry that she kissed an ex-boyfriend during her trip. Henry was hurt and upset, but the couple decided to stay together and move past the incident. When Melina's beauty salon business failed in early 2006, she and Henry decided to move back to Ecuador. Melina went ahead with their 2 children, while Henry stayed behind to sell their house and tie up loose financial ends. When Henry arrived in Ecuador, he learned that Melina had lost money in a bad investment, so he attacked her at his brother's house where the family was staying at the time. Henry's brother kicked him out after the violent fight, and he once again headed back to Canada. Melina and the children soon followed, and the family shared an apartment for a short period. But by then, the couple's marriage was falling apart. They were fighting constantly, and in May of 2006 they decided to separate. Hoping to make the marriage work, Henry persuaded Melina to reconcile, and the couple bought a house, but things didn't get better. Then, less than 2 months after separating and getting back together, the pair got into an argument over money and whether they could afford their next mortgage payment. Henry would later claim that Melina slapped him and told him that he disgusted her. She also asked her husband how he could promise things to his family that he was unable to provide. According to Henry, his wife admitted during the disagreement that she didn't love him anymore and that she only agreed to give their marriage a last-ditch effort because she wanted a house. Melina then allegedly said that she was leaving Henry, that her ex-boyfriend was going to replace him, and that she was taking the kids and Henry would never see them again. Unable to contain his rage, Henry strangled his wife to death, and by the time Melina's body was found, he was long gone from the scene. Melina had multiple injuries, including 5 broken ribs and a head wound, and before fleeing the scene, Henry addressed her in her pajamas. He then took their sons mini-golfing, and afterward he dropped them off at his brother's house before leaving for Mexico City, where he remained on the run for years to come. The search for Henry became frustrating as time dragged on, especially after an America's Most Wanted segment dedicated to the case failed to yield any major leads. Authorities finally tracked down Henry in 2019, and he was extradited to Canada to face justice. In his 14 years on the run, he had remarried, had more children, and landed a career as an English teacher. During Henry's trial, he claimed that he didn't remember the attack, but he insisted that he didn't mean to kill Milena, and that when he realized what he'd done, he was horrified and devastated. Henry's attorney urged the jury to consider her client's alleged lack of intent, and that if they decided that the intent was there, to consider whether Milena provoked her husband's deadly outburst. It would mean the difference between a murder conviction or a lesser manslaughter charge. Under Canada's provocation clause, a jury must rule that a defendant acted unlawfully, but understandably, to a sudden, wrongful act or insult. According to the Toronto Sun, Henry's lawyer reassured jurors that this type of ruling wouldn't mean that Milena was any less of a victim, but that her husband lost self-control during a moment of extreme anger. Unswayed by the defense, the jury convicted Henry Morales of second-degree murder, and as a result, he was sentenced to life in prison, with eligibility for parole after serving 15 years behind bars. 15. Amanda Bowden. For a nearly 2-week period in February 2013, a 19-year-old East Haven, Connecticut woman named Amanda Bowden made plans and threats to blow up Gateway Community College. During that time, disturbing content appeared on her Facebook page, including a photo of her holding a gun. Bowden discussed her destructive plans in great detail with a cooperating witness and eventually with an undercover FBI agent. During these conversations, she reportedly claimed to own guns and at least 2 napalm-based homemade bombs. She also mentioned wanting to commit a Sandy Hook-style school shooting. Thankfully, though, that never happened because someone did the right thing and went to law enforcement as soon as they suspected that Bowden was dangerous, rather than brushing it off as meaningless talk. Interestingly, no guns or explosives were found during a raid on the young woman's home, but Bowden was arrested on both state and federal charges. A few weeks later, Bowden pleaded guilty to 1 federal count of false information and hoaxes, and as a result she was sentenced to time served and 3 years of probation. While awaiting sentencing, she was released to a Salvation Army program which included mental health treatment. She was then taken back into federal custody 2 months later for violating the terms of her release and was transferred to a state mental hospital for inpatient care. And in a statement, US authorities reassured the public that Bowden's internet activity would be monitored during her probation period. 14. Karen Jones. In late 2020, a 55-year-old Lantana, Florida woman named Karen Jones shared her candid feelings about some of the state's most infamous politicians on Twitter. And by doing this, she learned the hard way that there's a right and a wrong way to express one's disdain for public figures. In a tweet, Karen accused Florida Governor Ron DeSantis and US Senators Marco Rubio and Rick Scott of looting the state. She then finished her thoughts by writing, "I'ma shoot them." Of course, law enforcement took the post a lot more serious than Karen expected. She told detectives that it was meant as a joke, but when they pointed out that there were no obvious indicators of humor in the post, like the use of "lol" or something to let people know it wasn't serious, Karen said that anyone who follows her knows her sense of humor. But in the end, she was charged with 3 counts of making written threats to kill or do bodily harm. 13. Alex Scott Roberts. In early 2018, a 22-year-old Los Angeles man named Alex Scott Roberts was convicted of 5 counts of attempted extortion and 1 battery by restraint charge for attempting to extort 14 victims for nude photos. Using an app to disguise his identity, he falsely claimed to have nude photos of the victims and threatened to publish them online if they refused to send him more. Roberts committed the crimes between March and May 2017 while on probation for prior convictions of attempted extortion and disseminating intimate photographs. He was sentenced to 6 years and 4 months in California State Prison for the more recent case, but was released after serving just a portion of the term. The repeat offender graced news headlines yet again in 2020 when he was arrested for cyberstalking and threatening 2 sisters in California and a 3rd victim in Georgia. After hearing about the latest batch of allegations against Roberts, state authorities took him back into custody on a probation violation. A few months later, he was federally indicted on 4 counts of stalking and 2 counts of making interstate threats. According to the indictment, Roberts embarked on a campaign of harassment against the sisters, listed as Victim 1 and Victim 2, after one of them told Roberts she no longer wanted any contact with him. In a Craigslist ad, he listed the family's home as being available for rent and invited prospective renters to stop by any time. After that, he began harassing a friend of Victim 1, demanding that they give him the woman's phone number. And much like his earlier crimes, he threatened to publish nude photos of Victim 1 online if his demands weren't met. On at least 2 occasions, Roberts directly messaged Victim 1 and Victim 2, claiming he was outside their house and that he planned to kill their family. In one text, he wrote, "I have a gun aimed right at both your mum and dad. If you don't respond, someone will die." He also claimed to have a sniper rifle aimed at one of the victim's bedroom windows. He also attempted to extort nude photographs from the 3rd victim. Roberts falsely claimed that he already had some pictures and threatened to send them to her family. After finishing his state sentence for the probation violation, Roberts was transferred to federal custody. He pleaded guilty to 2 counts of stalking and was sentenced to more than 7 years in prison. 12. Ramana Hedig Demirovic. It would be an understatement to call Ramana Hedig Demirovic an overprotective mother. Starting in 2016, the 47-year-old from San Francisco viciously harassed and cyberstalked anyone who upset her teenage daughter. Her first victim was a young man who'd only dated her daughter for a few days. According to the US Department of Justice, Demirovic went to the boy's school and tracked him down before accosting and threatening him. She then contacted his mother with false allegations that the victim had assaulted her daughter, who was named in court documents as Ira Demirovic. The second victim was a former friend of Ira's who became a target when the girls had a falling out. In addition to harassing and intimidating the victim through text, Demirovic threatened to set her up for a crime and to get her in trouble at her high school. Victim number 3 fell into Demirovic's destructive path after briefly dating her daughter. He received nasty text messages and threats of a restraining order, which would potentially hinder his chances of getting into college. Demirovic also contacted the man's employer and school with false allegations of physical abuse, drug use, and a drinking problem. The situation ultimately caused the victim to quit his job. And as if she hadn't caused enough damage, Demirovic also made several fake social media accounts impersonating the young man. Starting in 2018, a 4th victim endured a relentless campaign to destroy his life. Using fake social media accounts, some reflecting made-up personas and others impersonating the victim, Demirovic and her daughter sent hundreds of messages and made dozens of posts in a bid to ruin his reputation. They contacted the victim himself, as well as his family, friends, school officials, and even strangers. And in their posts, they alluded to the victim being an abusive drug user. They also accused him of being a cyberbully and filed a complaint at his college claiming he stalked and harassed multiple women. The victim fought back against what was happening, and a judge issued a temporary restraining order banning Demirovic from harassing the man and his family. However, she violated it by continuing to do exactly that. According to court documents, Ira falsely accused the man of violently assaulting her. When federal authorities arrested Demirovic in 2022, she reportedly claimed that she was simply trying to protect her daughter. But the court didn't see it that way, and neither did the victims, who were left emotionally traumatized by the harassment. Demirovic was convicted of 7 counts of cyberstalking and 1 count of conspiracy to commit cyberstalking. And in the end, she was sentenced to 3 years in prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release. 11. Jonathan Robinson. 27-year-old mother of 3 Ranita Williams was broadcasting live on Facebook from her Shreveport, Louisiana home one day in 2018 when her ex-boyfriend kicked in the door and barged in. Renita's brother escaped and called the police, while her out-of-control ex, Jonathan Robinson, terrorized her at gunpoint. After noticing that Renita was airing a live video, Robinson forced her to apologize to his new girlfriend for making fun of the woman on social media. He could also be heard saying things like, "I'm gonna make you famous," and "I don't care about the police." Robinson fired at least a half-dozen gunshots as Renita begged him to stop. He fired 3 more times from behind Renita as she dropped her phone onto the floor. As he stood over the woman, Robinson could be heard calling her a derogatory name and saying, "Game over." Those who were watching would soon have their worst fears confirmed. Renita had been shot multiple times, and she died from her injuries. 8 officers responded to the scene and were immediately met with gunfire from Robinson. One officer was struck in the arm, but luckily he survived. An 80-minute standoff ensued before Robinson was taken into custody on suspicion of first-degree murder. It wasn't his first violent crime either. In fact, he had a lengthy criminal past, which included convictions for domestic battery and the attempted murder of a previous girlfriend. Robinson ultimately pleaded guilty to the charge in exchange for having the death penalty taken off the table and was sentenced to life without parole. He apologized profusely to Renita's mother, Anita, during his sentencing hearing, and by then he'd sent her numerous apologetic letters asking for her forgiveness. He also apologized to the police for shooting at them. And in response to the man's emotional pleas, Anita Williams calmly said, "I've forgiven you already." 10. Liz Golia. 35-year-old auto mechanic Dave Krupa met and began casually dating a 37-year-old computer programmer named Carrie Farver in 2012. But at the time, Dave was also seeing another woman named Shanna Liz Golia. His connection with Carrie quickly grew into more than he'd planned for though, and she soon became his main focus over other women. 2 weeks after the pair met, Dave let Carrie crash at his apartment in Omaha, Nebraska, to spare her the hour-long commute to her workplace from neighboring Iowa. One day, while he was at work, he received a text message from Carrie asking if they could move in together. But it was too soon for that, so Dave said no. He then received a barrage of profanity-laden text messages from Carrie, stating that she hated him, that it was over, and that she didn't want to see him anymore. Assuming that he'd misjudged Carrie's character, Dave felt relieved that the relationship had ended early on. But the harassment continued, and Liz also began receiving nasty messages and emails. In the meantime, Carrie texted her mother saying she'd taken a job in Kansas and asked her to look after her son, Max, while she was gone. But this was out of character for Carrie, so her family reported her missing in Iowa. Due to her history of bipolar disorder, police assumed she'd stopped taking her medication and had run off in the throes of an episode. Liz and Dave endured near constant harassment, both online and in real life. But when Liz found her garage vandalized and Dave realized he was being spied on through his windows, the police got involved. Carrie's family continued to receive messages, but she refused to talk on the phone and missed major family events. Her loved ones grew increasingly concerned, especially after visiting Carrie's house and seeing that all her stuff was there. For nearly 3 years, Liz and Dave endured continued torment while Carrie's family desperately tried to locate her. At one point, Liz received a link to an obituary in her name, describing her as a man-stealer who was better off dead. Someone even set her home on fire, killing her pets and destroying most of her belongings. Dave changed his number repeatedly, but couldn't escape the constant messages. One night, while he had a woman over, someone threw a brick through the window. And another time, he arrived at work to find Dave beats women spray-painted on the building. But, surprisingly, in 2015, detectives discovered that the threatening correspondence was actually coming from Liz's phone and computer. They also found photos of Carrie's dead body on the devices and Liz's DNA in Carrie's abandoned car. By then, Dave had moved out of the area to be closer to his kids and their mother, Amy Flora. Not realizing she was under suspicion for killing Carrie, Liz called the police one night. Someone had shot her in the leg, and she seemed intent on convincing the police that Amy was the culprit. But detectives quickly ruled Amy out as a suspect. The incident only solidified their suspicions that Liz tormented David and the women in his life out of jealousy while posing as a victim. Police concluded that she was behind the years-long harassment campaign and had most likely killed Carrie the day Dave began receiving weird messages at work. She also likely burned her own house down. Before arresting her, investigators tricked her into thinking they suspected Amy of killing Carrie and treated her as a potential ally who could help with the investigation. But in reality, they were waiting to see if Liz would further incriminate herself. Sure enough, she came back to them with the email she supposedly received from Amy, which they once again traced back to Liz herself. The messages included a confession with bone-chilling details about how Amy supposedly stabbed Carrie to death and burned her body. Carrie's remains were never found, but the case was strong enough for the jury to convict Liz of murder. And now she's serving a life sentence without parole and continues to maintain her innocence in the case. 9. David Matuzewicz. New Jersey-based optometrist David Matuzewicz and his wife Christine Belford went their separate ways in 2006 after 5 years of marriage and 3 daughters. David and his parents became obsessed with winning custody of the kids, and they were infuriated when the judge ruled in Christine's favor. So, in 2007, David and his mother Lenore kidnapped the girls and fled the country. Nearly 2 years later, they were found living in a filthy motorhome in Nicaragua. The children were then returned to Christine and David was arrested. He argued that Christine was abusive and that he only kidnapped the girls to keep them safe, but the court found no evidence of Christine being an unfit parent. Then, in 2009, the court terminated David's parental rights and sentenced him to 4 years in prison, followed by 5 years of probation for kidnapping and bank fraud. Acting on David's instructions from behind bars, Lenore Matuzewicz, David's father Thomas and his sister Amy Gonzalez embarked on a relentless campaign of harassment and slander against Christine. They hired a friend to spy on Christine, created a website dedicated to ruining her reputation, contacted the kids' church and schools, and posted videos online falsely accusing her of abusing one of her daughters. The family claimed that Christine had tried to poison her former mother-in-law and that she'd mentioned wanting to sell her kids. They also persuaded David's high school girlfriend to befriend Christine and report back to them with information, including her Facebook password. The obsessive torment continued for years. In an email to her lawyer in 2011, Christine wrote that David had nothing to lose. She entertained a few different possible outcomes of the situation, stating, "He may allow me to survive, to suffer. I may survive long enough to watch the girls be harmed. I may even go missing." Then, one day, while David was still in prison, Thomas Matuzewicz drove from his home in Hidalgo County, Texas, to Christine's house in Delaware. In a disturbing confrontation that was captured on camera, Christine's boyfriend told Thomas to leave the property while the girls hid inside. This left Christine so shaken up that she put her house up for sale. David was released from prison in 2012 and moved in with his parents in Texas. In early 2013, he received permission to attend a child support hearing in Delaware, even though he had the option to attend by phone. And on the morning of the hearing, David hugged his father in the courthouse lobby and went upstairs. As Christine entered the courthouse, Thomas shot her and her friend, Laura Beth Mulford, who'd come with her for moral support. Sadly, both women died from their injuries. And 2 police officers were wounded in the shootout, which only ended when Thomas turned the gun on himself. Investigators found weapons, ammunition, and a hit list in the car David and his father had driven to court that day. It contained the list of everyone they believed had wronged them, including the judge who oversaw David's sentencing in the kidnapping case. After discovering the family's long-standing vendetta, authorities charged David Matuzewicz, Lenore Matuzewicz, and Amy Gonzalez with stalking Christine and causing her death. All 3 defendants were convicted of conspiracy, interstate stalking resulting in death, and cyber stalking resulting in death. And as a result, they were sentenced to life in prison. This was America's first ever conviction for cyberstalking, resulting in death, setting a precedent for future cases of its kind. 8. Sharif Bonner and Tyree Pitts. What began as a social media feud between 46-year-old Daryl Smith and 24-year-old Sharif Bonner erupted into real-life violence one morning in 2022 when Bonner and his friends decided to make Smith pay for his words. A short while later, sheriff's deputies responded to reports of gunfire at a home in Silanti Township, Michigan, and found Smith suffering from bullet wounds. He was then rushed to the hospital, where he died from his injuries. At the time of the shooting, Smith was broadcasting live on Facebook from outside the residence. In the video, he could be seen standing up and saying, "We got action." Then a few seconds later, shots broke out, and the phone fell to the ground as the gunfire continued. Afterward, someone could be heard calling 911. At the scene, deputies found shell casings from 3 different guns. Throughout the course of the investigation, authorities identified Bonner and 2 others, 19-year-old Corian Brown and 18-year-old Tyree Pitts, as the alleged shooters. Bonner was captured in Georgia after being on the run for a month and extradited back to Michigan on an open murder charge. Pitts, Brown, and 3 others who were there at the time of the shooting were also charged with murder. During a court hearing, Bonner's aunt Martita said that the group collectively decided to confront Smith over things he said online, and along the way they stopped at Bonner's apartment so he could grab a gun. They drove to the residence in a 3-vehicle convoy and sped off immediately after the shooting. According to Martita, the suspected shooters went to a nearby mall and bought new clothes while she disposed of the guns. She told law enforcement that she wouldn't have gone along with the group if she knew a shooting was going to occur. Martita and another defendant, Jeremiah Castillon, agreed to testify against their co-defendants in exchange for a plea deal for a reduced charge of conspiracy to commit murder. The defense accused them of trying to save their own skins, but the outcome of the case remains to be seen. 7. Kendra Gale Licari. Over a several-month period starting in 2021, a mum from Mount Pleasant, Michigan, allegedly harassed her own daughter and the young woman's boyfriend in a bizarre and cruel catfishing scheme. Authorities have accused 42-year-old Kendra Gale Licari of using a virtual private network, or VPN, to mask her location while barraging the victims with a multitude of abusive and threatening text and social media messages. According to court documents, she then tried to frame a high school student for the crimes. At the time, Licari was working as a girls' basketball coach at her daughter's high school, but this is no longer the case. In late 2022, she was charged with 2 counts of stalking, 2 counts of using a computer to commit a crime, and 1 count of obstruction of justice. Licari pleaded guilty to 2 counts of stalking and received a prison sentence of 19 months to 5 years. And even though the case is concluded, there are lingering questions that have yet to be answered, like why Licari did what she did. Isabella County prosecutor David Barbary described the case as one of the most confusing and complicated she's ever dealt with in her career. While Licari's daughter urged the court for leniency, the family of the other victim, Owen McKenney, urged the judge to throw the book at her. In a victim impact statement, Owen's mother Jill expressed her dismay at Licari's actions, wondering out loud how a mother could do what she did, especially for so long. She also expressed her concerns about the long-term impact on her son's mental health and questioned the same thing everyone else wants to know: Licari's motive. Before she got nailed for being the catfish, Licari acted like a concerned parent. She even got together with Jill to discuss the ongoing harassment and tried to figure out who was behind it. They reported it to the police together. But all the while, according to Jill, Licari was well aware of the damage that the catfishing was doing to the victims. At her sentencing hearing, Licari tearfully apologized and said she was getting mental help, but she didn't explain the reasons behind her crimes. 6. Lester Brown. In mid-March 2018, 30-year-old Christopher Harris picked up his daughter from a dance in Raytown, Missouri, and drove her to her mother's house in Independence. It's unclear whether he knew he was being followed the entire drive by a vehicle that pulled up behind him in the driveway. 2 armed men exited the car and opened fire on Lester's vehicle while he shouted repeatedly that his daughter was in the car. One of the gunmen, later identified as Lester Brown, continued to shoot as Harris got out of his car and attempted to run inside. His daughter made it into the house, but he was shot and fell to the ground. And as he lay dying, Brown stood over him and fired 2 more shots. Investigators traced the crime to Brown, who was on supervised release for a previous felony conviction, along with 2 co-conspirators, Michael Young and Rennell Pearson. According to court documents, the trio cyberstalked, threatened, and harassed Harris on social media over a several-month period starting in late 2017. They demanded $10,000 monthly payments from Harris, sent him photos of GPS devices, and planted GPS devices on vehicles belonging to Harris and his associates. According to court documents, the murder had something to do with the parties being involved in rival marijuana trafficking operations. One message that was sent to Harris on Snapchat prior to his death stated, "Man, you are gonna end up like Ryan." The statement was a reference to the disappearance and death of Ryan Cobbins, an associate of Harris who vanished in Kansas City after a haircut appointment in October 2013. Harris and another person paid a $20,000 ransom to Brown, who posed as a middleman and claimed he could ensure Cobbins' safe return. This never happened, and Cobbins was found dead with multiple gunshot wounds more than a year later, and nobody was ever charged in connection with his murder. Young and Pearson each pleaded guilty to a conspiracy charge, and Young pleaded guilty to an additional charge of cyber-stalking resulting in death. They're currently being held in jail as they await their sentencing hearings. Brown was convicted of conspiracy to commit cyber-stalking, 1 count of cyber-stalking resulting in death, and being a felon in possession of a firearm. He faces a maximum sentence of life in prison and is awaiting his sentencing as well. 5. Mauricio Garcia. In yet another of the seemingly countless mass shootings that are plaguing the United States, a gunman clad in black body armor opened fire on a crowd at the Allen Premium Outlet shopping mall outside Dallas. He continued shooting for 3 to 4 minutes while terrified members of the public ran for cover, and when the police arrived, shots were still being fired. The gunman killed 8 people and injured 7 others, but he lost his own life in a shootout with responding officers. Authorities identified the shooter as 33-year-old Mauricio Garcia, a seemingly ordinary civilian who previously worked as a security guard and had no prior criminal history. But after taking a closer look at his background, there were signs of problems brewing. Garcia enlisted in the US Army in 2008, but was released during basic training due to mental health concerns. Because it wasn't a disciplinary separation, it didn't appear on background checks. Years later, in the months and weeks leading up to the shooting, Garcia referenced his mental health and extreme beliefs in numerous posts on a Russian social media platform. In at least 2 posts, he praised previous mass shooters, including one who went on a rampage because he hated women. In another, he worried about how his family might feel regarding what he was about to do, and said that no psychologist could have helped him. He also supported anti-Semitic, misogynistic, and white nationalist views. And over a 2-week period before the massacre, Garcia posted more than 24 photos of Allen Premium Outlets. At the crime scene, officers observed a patch on his vest symbolizing extremist ideology. They also found 4 guns on Garcia and in his car. Receipts posted on his social media showed that he spent thousands of dollars on guns the year before the shooting. While a motive for the crime was never officially specified, it seems evident that Garcia's hateful beliefs played a role in his decision. Several right-wing broadcasters speculated that he was actually a psyop, in other words, a government agent who was planted to generate certain reactions for the purpose of manipulating society at large. Others claimed that Garcia was a drug trafficker, an illegal immigrant, or a member of a street gang. But these beliefs are largely regarded as false, and there's no reason to believe that a conspiracy was involved. 4. Matthew Hardy. For 11 years, an unknown number of women in Great Britain were terrorized by an anonymous stalker who left them with lasting emotional trauma. In most cases, the conversations began with the stalker sending the target a message claiming that someone in their life was betraying her, a cheating partner, a backstabbing friend, or something similar. But the conversation eventually took an intimidating tone. and as soon as a victim sensed that something was off and stopped talking to the stalker, all hell broke loose. Oftentimes, the victim would receive dozens of phone calls from someone who breathed heavily but didn't talk. The stalker also began spreading nasty rumors about the victim to their friends and family, including claims of affairs with bosses, stepfathers, and other people. In some cases, they impersonated people in the victim's life. And sometimes, the stalker pretended to be the victim themselves, sending explicit and incriminating messages. The stalker would even go so far as to share the victim's nude photos online. Some victims realized they were being watched when they received messages describing where they were, what they were wearing, or what they were doing. The harassment destroyed friendships, relationships, and even family ties. It also ruined job opportunities for some victims. One woman became so terrified that she slept with a baseball bat, while another kept a samurai sword nearby. Nobody knows how many women were victimized, but authorities believe that there were at least 63 victims and quite possibly more. In 2021, the stalker was identified as a 30-year-old jobless man named Matthew Hardy. He was arrested more than 10 times over the years and was even convicted in some cases, but somehow he'd managed to evade any serious punishment. Some of the women who reported him later told the press that the police didn't seem to take their complaints seriously. According to The Guardian, the average prison sentence for stalking in the UK is 17 months or less. But given the severity of Hardy's crimes, the court saw fit to impose a much heavier sentence. He pleaded guilty to 5 stalking counts and 1 count of violating a restraining order and was sentenced to 9 years. It was the longest sentence ever handed to a stalker in Great Britain. Hardy appealed the sentence, arguing that his Asperger's syndrome made him incapable of understanding the impacts of his actions on the victims, and so the court knocked a year off his sentence. Stalking is a serious crime that puts many people's lives in danger, but police and prosecutors have historically been reluctant to investigate and prosecute cases. Many people believe the punishments are unfairly light, and that it leads to a lot of preventable murders by giving the perpetrators ample opportunity to strike again. 3. Dominic Jade Dragan. A relationship that only lasted a month and ended no later than 2011 came back to haunt a Chicago woman 9 years later when she began receiving racist and threatening messages on Instagram out of nowhere. The harassment came from numerous accounts, but the victim, known only as AR, suspected that the culprit was her ex from years earlier, 28-year-old Dominic J. Dragan. One message said, "I can't wait to hear the bones in your neck break," and another said, "I'm gonna put a bullet in your forehead." The messages also contained even worse statements which are too horrific to say out loud. AR's mother and her partner, who live in Tampa, also received death threats. There was also reason for the victims to fear that they were being stalked in person, because one of them received a threatening message while they were shopping for groceries. After enduring the harassment for nearly a year and a half, the victims reported it to the FBI. By then, they'd changed their daily lives and routines out of a fear that Dragan would track them down and hurt or kill them. They were unable to sleep soundly, and one of them brought a gun for protection. During questioning, Dragan admitted to making threatening comments on Instagram, but he allegedly continued to do so even after being interviewed by law enforcement. In the end, he pleaded to 2 counts of cyberstalking and was sentenced to 3 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release. 2. Anthony Ilonis. In an ongoing saga spanning more than a decade, a Pennsylvania man named Anthony Ilonis was first arrested in 2010 for making threatening Facebook posts targeting his ex-wife and others. The posts first appeared in the wake of several unfortunate events in Anthony's life, including his ex-wife leaving him and the loss of his job at an amusement park. Authorities charged him with 5 counts of violating a federal anti-threat statute. And besides his wife, he was accused of targeting a kindergarten class, a local police agency, co-workers, and an FBI agent. In court, Ilonis asked for the charges to be dismissed, arguing that the posts weren't actual threats. He claimed to be an aspiring rap artist and defended his words as a form of artistic expression and a therapeutic release. In short, Ilonis argued that he didn't threaten anyone because he didn't mean what he said in a literal sense. The court disagreed though, ruling that the posts could legally be considered threats because a reasonable person would interpret them that way. Ilonis was found guilty on 4 out of 5 counts and was sentenced to 44 months in federal prison followed by 3 years of probation. He appealed his conviction, but the ruling was upheld. The case attracted national attention and sparked widespread debates over what constitutes free speech on social media. History repeated itself in 2022 when Ilonis was charged with 3 counts of cyberstalking. This time, he was accused of harassing his ex-wife, an ex-girlfriend, and a government employee. According to prosecutors, he sent threatening, harassing, and intimidating emails to the government employee, while targeting all 3 victims in social media posts, text messages, and voicemail. The crimes took place over a 3-year period from 2018 to 2021, during which time Ilonis violated a Protection from Abuse Order, PFA, his ex-girlfriend took out against him. As a result, he was convicted of all 3 counts and received a sentence of more than 12.5 years in prison. 1. Kathy Ann Hendrickson. After connecting with a man on a dating site in 2015 or 2016, a woman in her 50s named Kathy Ann Hendrickson drove from Walla Walla, Washington to his home in Trout Creek, Montana. They met a handful of times before the man, known only as John Doe, began to suspect Hendrickson of stealing his wallet and stopped seeing her. In 2018, John Doe received an anonymous email threatening to bring him down. Around the same time, Doe and his friends began receiving dozens of prank calls from unfamiliar phone numbers. Someone then hacked into John Doe's email account and sent nasty and threatening messages to multiple people, including Hendrickson, her friends, former Montana Governor Steve Bullock, and other public officials. Some of the emails even contained death threats. In the message to the governor, the imposter warned Bullock to be aware of his surroundings and said they had guns and were willing to use them. And 2 county commissioners received messages stating, "You're going to die." Hendrickson forwarded the threatening messages she received to law enforcement. But at some point, the FBI got involved and began to suspect that Hendrickson wasn't telling the truth about the situation. They seized her phone and discovered evidence that she had, in fact, been stalking and harassing John Doe, and harassing other people while pretending to be him. A few days after the raid, Hendrickson called an FBI office and a US Attorney's office using a burner phone that authorities had suspected her of having all along. She wanted to know when she'd get her primary phone back, but she was hit with a cyber-stalking charge instead. Hendrickson was convicted of the charge in early 2022 and was sentenced to 52 months in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release.
Would you rather go viral for being a stupid criminal or for acting entitled and throwing an explosive tantrum? Let us know in the comments down below. And if you enjoyed this video, be sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one. Bye.